This is a production of Cornell University.
Hi, my name is Dick Miller. I teach in the philosophy department. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first in our series of climate controversies. I'm a member of the Cornell Climate Change Forum, which is sponsoring this series of talks in which leading figures in humanity's response to global warming will address leading questions about how to respond to it and talk about these live controversies. We're dedicated to the view that mutual learning among faculty and students and staff and people in the Ithaca community is essential to framing the right response to this uniquely complex problem. That's why we're a group of 50 faculty from over a dozen departments. For the Climate Controversies series, we depend on generous sponsorship by the Cornell Center for a Sustainable Future and generous co-sponsorship from the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and the College of Engineering. I can think of no problem that more agonizingly combines the cosmic, the complex, and the practical than the problem of containing global warming. That makes our first speaker an ideal first speaker because his work is at once strikingly practical and addressed to the largest scale aspects of the global warming challenge in all of its many facets. He is Detlef van Vuuren. He is a senior researcher at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. As a leading member of their climate change team and as a lead author of the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Detlef has described how to find a safe landing for the climate in terms that are now the scientific framework for negotiations over a successor to Kyoto. I can think of no more striking example of science setting the framework for negotiations that are vital to the future of humanity. But what we do with the scientific framework is, of course, for us to decide how the United States will respond as it overcomes its torpor of the past will largely be determined by what people in the United States do. In being provided with this framework, we are being provided with a controversial framework, so it's important to discuss the framework and questions that you have about it as a basis for your choosing what to do. That will be Detlef's task in his talk on the theme, How Low Can We Go? Cutting Emissions to Contain Global Warming. After his presentation, Zalman Warhoft from Mechanical Engineering and Aerospace, Engineering, will briefly respond based on his own work on what it would take to contain the challenge of global warming. Then we'll open the floor to general discussion in the first of these encounters about this challenge to humanity. It's the first of 6 of these encounters. We hope in the course of the semester we'll all learn a lot from one another. So I give you Detlef van Vuuren to talk about how low we can go.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to the audience here at Cornell. Today I've been discussing with several people already issues that are important for climate policy and climate policy research here at Cornell, and I found them very stimulating. So again, thank you very much for asking me over. I'm from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. It's a government think tank for the Netherlands government. We are independent. And one of the things that we look into is climate policy. And we run an integrated assessment model called IMAGE, which is looking into climate policy, energy use into the future, land use, and things like that. Integrated assessment of climate change means that we are dealing with a lot of different disciplines economics, technology assumptions, the scope for policy. On the one hand, dealing with that in a model is obviously very interesting and very policy relevant. It also means that we're dealing with several topics that are relatively hard to deal with within models, and many of the things that we deal with are not really science, but much more assessment. And as you will see in my presentation, some of the things that we produce are certainly assumptions related, assumptions driven. We're doing the best that we can because we're trying to answer policy questions that are very, very relevant. We're taking these questions up, but it also means that many of the things are controversial and can be debated. A few of the main messages that come out of our work, and I will describe them in the presentation, are that we believe that there are still scope for limiting global warming to about 2 degrees targets. But that's already getting on the limit of what we can achieve. I will show you in the presentation that for such a target, global emissions probably need to peak around 2020, which on its turn would require participation of all major countries. I will also discuss that technology and economics are, based on our work, not the most important obstacles of achieving such a target. That doesn't mean that it's not a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, but it's much more because we have to find somehow societies to work towards this target, but not only our own societies, we have to find somehow a global deal and working to this target, which has to change the global energy system. It has major consequences for global land use, for instance, so it's a huge challenge. Uncertainties play a really big role in this, and also even if we aim for a 2-degree target, we should be aware that there's no guarantees that we're getting there, and we might want to prepare for much more than that. There are 4 different topics in my presentation. So where do we go if we don't have a climate policy? Where do we want to aim for? So how low should we go? What's the scope for action on global perspectives? How low can we go? But then also, what's the scope for action if we bring in this fact that we have to find this deal with all the countries in this world? So taking up the first question, what could happen if we do not have no climate policy? This is the global energy use over the last 150 years. It's a system that's dominated at the moment by fossil fuels, indicated here in gray for coal, in yellowish for oil, and bluish for natural gas. About 80 to 90% of our energy use worldwide is fossil fuels. We have developed many different scenarios about what could the future look like, but basically many of those will look like this. If we don't have climate policy, it's very likely that we continue to use lots of fossil fuels. And because our oil resources and our natural gas resources are limited in a sense, and production costs will go up, it's actually quite likely that we will even use much more coal in the future. Now, the consequence of such a scenario is pretty clear. It means much more CO2 emissions, so also in terms of temperature increase, quite an increase in global mean temperature. These scenarios we have run through the same kind of scenario models that the IPCC has been using, and we would indicate that for such scenarios, temperature increase could be in the order of 2 to 6 degrees. 2 degrees if we are lucky, if the climate system is not so sensitive to greenhouse gases. 6 degrees by the end of the century if we're in a bad shape and the climate system is according to the most sensitive estimates. So what is the consequence of such a temperature increase? This picture is actually from the Stern Review, published by the UK government in 2006. But IPCC has made a similar view where they mapped temperature increase on one axis and then all kinds of possible impacts on the other axis. And there are quite some impacts. For instance, they indicate that in developing countries there could be impacts for agriculture. We expect, for instance, quite some impact for ecosystems, And according to the Stern review, things like that could happen already at 2 or 3 degrees. We expect impacts in terms of water and water availability in different parts of the world. And for instance, also, people expect an increase in extreme weather events. And again, the Stern review put that as something that could happen already at 1 degree, but would increase in extent along with global mean temperature. So if we plot the previous graph on top of that, in the previous graph we indicate that a 3 degrees scenario, a 3 degrees increase by the end of this century would be something that is quite consistent with doing things as we are doing right now. And in between 2 and 6 degrees, you see that many of these impacts could happen. Now, many of these things might be things that we don't want. So the next question is, where do we want to aim for if we don't want this? Now, there are several ways that you could approach this question. The start would be the Climate Change Convention, where all the countries in the world have agreed that stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system would be the starting point of global climate policy. This is agreed upon by all the governments, more or less. It's agreed upon by China, it's agreed upon by Western Europe, it's agreed upon by the US. But what does it mean, trying to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference? And there are several ways that scientists have tried to approach that question. And basically you can divide those into 2 ways. One of them is the risk-based approach, and the second way is the cost-benefit approach. The risk-based approach is more or less the graph that I've shown you before. You map out what could happen under different types of temperature increase, and then consider the things that you don't want, the type of risk that you would you would like to avoid, and based on that, work out the temperature increase that you are willing to accept at the maximum. The cost-benefit analysis is more the economic way of looking at this problem. You would map out the consequences of temperature increase in terms of climate change impacts, and those impacts will tend to increase along with global mean temperature, so you would have increasing costs. But on the other hand, you have your mitigation costs. They are in the opposite way. If you want to avoid climate change, your cost will go up, and you can look for an optimum. Now, people working on those 2 different approaches have published their optimal temperature in the past, and we can invite them to come into this arena. And for instance, Jim Hansen is clearly working from a risk approach. When he, in 2007, looked into what would be an optimal temperature increase, and he said an increase of about 1 degree above the global temperature in 2000 is likely to be dangerous. As in 2000, the global temperature had already increased by about 0.7 degrees. This corresponds more or less to 1.7 degrees compared to pre-industrial. This is Bill Nordhaus from Yale University, and he is approaching this same question, but then with a cost-benefit analysis. He has developed a small model and looks into the question what he finds optimal. And his model says optimal would be a 2.8 degrees warming by the end of the century, and then it may actually continue to increase, and maybe 3.4 degrees by the end of the century after that. So this is optimal in his sense that the cost of mitigation climate policy are equal to the cost of preventing it. The EU, and this is the Officer for the Environment, Mr. Dimas, has also looked into this. And the EU has decided that based on its evaluation of a risk approach, again, it would say 2 degrees is something that is optimal for their perspective. But it got criticism for that as well. This is Richard Toll, which is also a cost-benefit analysis economist. And he actually responded to the EU by saying that he doesn't believe the 2 degrees target is credible. First of all, it might not be optimal, but secondly, it's not credible in the sense he doesn't believe that we can really achieve it, and therefore he finds it actually target that is not helping us, but it's actually preventing climate policy. And by the way, he doesn't believe that any stabilization scenario is interesting. He could foresee a future that continues to increase greenhouse gases concentrations and temperature for quite a while. How can we understand why there is such a difference in different positions of people? Yes, we can. First of all, we have these two approaches to the problem, this risk approach and this cost-benefit analysis approach. But even if you use the cost-benefit analysis approach, you can easily create different outcomes within a single model. And what we have done here is we took one cost-benefit analysis model. The model evaluates the cost of climate policy against the cost of the impacts. And then we looked into many different uncertainties. So we, for instance, looked into what the baseline emissions and what influence they had, but especially also the images of damages. If you change the damage estimates that people have published and you run the model again and you look into what would be the outcome, that's what we've done here. And so for all these uncertainties, we could find an optimal temperature for this particular model. And so in the default assumptions, we got a 2.8, 2.7 degrees outcome in this model. And then we run these different assumptions. And what I want to point out is that discounting was actually by far the most important variable in this model that influenced the outcome. This is discounting future cost and express them in present cost, and different approaches are used. Bill Nordhaus, for instance, uses a discount rate which starts at 6%. It decreases over the century. He ends up with about 3% by the end of the century, which has an influence that it decreases the future damage cost of climate change, and doesn't. And while many of the cost of mitigation are much earlier in time, it doesn't decrease those as much. Therefore, his model finds that it's optimal to wait a while. The Stern Review, it's also a cost-benefit analysis study, published in 2006 by the UK government, used a completely different cost-benefit discounting rate. It's more or less used a discount rate of about 1.2%. And the result of that is that if you just change the discount rate, you can find a 2.2 degrees target optimal, but you can also find a 3.5 degrees target optimal. So even in the cost-benefit framework, we can change the outcome easily, and it depends not on all these scientific uncertainties. It strongly depends simply on our moral standing of which discount rate to use. It's much more an ethical choice than an issue of uncertainty. Now, obviously, this is a big question. Between the climate policy advocated by Nordhaus and the climate policy advocated by the Stern Review approach, we're talking about hundreds of billions, thousands of billions differences in cost. Martin Weitzman, working at one of the universities here as well in the US, and also an economist, responded to this whole debate by saying that he actually found something else even much more important. And that's the fact that if you look at the predictions for climate change into the future, there are these standard estimates, but there's also a chance that it's actually far worse than we think. And that there is this possibility of a runaway climate. If he looks into that, he says, okay, 10 degrees warming would be probably a disaster. Anyway, we wouldn't know how to judge that because we don't have any information of what 10 degrees warming would mean. If we are certain that we want to avoid something like that, cost-benefit analysis might not be the right approach anyway to look at this, because it's somehow giving an estimate of cost for things that we don't know. That's essential for that particular type of analysis. So maybe we should not use that particular analysis and go back to the risk approach, what he is advocating. So this is the risk approach again. This is the Stern Review, and for the EU it meant that it's advocating a 2-degree target. In most of our work, we're trying to look into what are the implications of a 2-degree target. It doesn't necessarily mean that we would endorse that particular target, but we're at least looking at what does it mean to do something like that. Now, there are many targets that have been advocated by different governments and by different societal groups, and they obviously are related. And if you look at the chain of climate change, going from human activities to emissions of greenhouse gases, concentrations, climate change, and impacts, you could, for instance, make a target for impacts. And the UNFCCC target is, in a way, an example of that. No dangerous interference. Then you could say, no, you would like to formulate a target for temperature increase, like the EU has advocated a maximum increase of about 2 degrees. The next question is, how do you translate that into a concentration target? People have advocated a 350 target. Other people have advocated a 450 target. Obviously, there are, if you wouldn't go to 2 degrees, you could also advocate a higher target. There's also, you could set targets on emissions. Recently, in 2007, there was this, the G8 advocating that a 50% reduction in 2050 might be something to consider. The next step, you would translate those emissions into regional emission targets. The EU, for instance, now proposes a 20% reduction in the EU in 2020. And finally, you could also think of sectoral targets or targets related to our activities, like, for instance, a 20% renewable target. If you are trying to make a policy, you have to somehow make a consistent set of these types of targets. The EU, obviously, when it advocates a 2-degree target, it will not expect people just to respond to that 2-degree target. It has to somehow formulate then how that translates back into things that people can really do on the ground. So the scope for action from a global perspective. If we accept the 2-degree target, our first step would be to translate that into a greenhouse concentration target. And that's not easy, because we have this huge uncertainty between greenhouse gas concentrations and warming. And what this graph is showing you is the so-called climate sensitivity. It's the increase for a doubling of the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And different scientists have published different probability distribution functions for this particular variable. And you see all kinds of studies that have been published. The IPCC actually, when in its latest report, said that the most likely value would be around 3 degrees, and that it's not very likely that it would be below 2, and on the upper hand, it suggested maybe 4.5 would be something to consider, but it could not really bound that. Now, many others have published as well these probability distribution functions. Now, if you accept that there is this huge uncertainty, we also have problems translating a 2-degree target into one single answer for concentration. There is no single concentration that corresponds to 2 degrees. There's just different probabilities for different concentration targets. For a 450 CO2 equivalent concentration in the atmosphere, in general, you get about a 50% probability that you would stay below 2 degrees. For a 400 ppm CO2 equivalent concentration, this may be in the order of 80%. If you go to a 550 target, your probability of staying below 2 degrees will drop maybe to about 30%. This is also shown in the next graphs. This is actually from the IPCC report. And this is showing you, first of all, the emissions if we have no climate policy. and the temperature that is associated with that, and we come back into this range that I mentioned before. If we introduce mild climate policy, that expected temperature increase will go down. This is actually the equilibrium temperature, so it's not the temperature in 2100, but the temperature that will finally result. Now, we introduce stronger and stronger climate policy, and the lowest scenarios, these are the scenarios around 450, would actually finally give you a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees. This more or less corresponds with a 50% reduction in 2050, if you can see these graphs. This lowest category more or less peaks global emissions around 2020, then it reduces emissions quite steeply until about 50% in 2050, and by the end of the century, they might even have to go negative. I will say a bit more about that later on. If we then review the literature, and this is from the IPCC report as well, about who has published such scenarios, and these are the same categories of scenarios, from doing almost nothing to be really, really stringent. These are the number of scenarios published in the literature around 2006 and around before 2006 that fall in these different categories. So we have many, many studies that have looked at targets around 650 ppm CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. We have hardly any studies that have looked to 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. Now, this is bad news for the EU, obviously, if they have a 2-degree target, but nobody is really publishing scenarios that correspond to that and how to get to that. It's not a very helpful target. So in our work, we have tried to then look into this. Can we increase that number? Can we publish pathways that get you to 2 degrees? And actually, of those 6 that are shown there already, half of them were from our study. Just to indicate you, from a baseline, if we want to go to 650, 550, or 450 CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, we're talking about avoiding, across the whole century, about 600 to 1,200 gigatons of carbon. So is there a way that we can find technologies that will save you, over the century, 1,200 gigatons of carbon? Now, this is already a few years ago, made an overview of potentials as published in the literature of what could individual technologies achieve. And those are here. And if you map them out and you would just sum them up, your conclusion would be, yes, obviously, there's lots of technologies, and if you could simply sum them, you could easily get to this 1,200. Now, obviously, you cannot do that in that way. You're double counting. Many of those cannot be combined, and there are ranges as well. So instead of doing it in this way, you should actually try to integrate these analyses and to try to build scenarios that use combinations of these technologies. Before continuing, I want to point out that, luckily enough, we have one other weapon in our arsenal which can help us a bit, which is that in the past we have looked so far mostly on stabilization scenarios. And we published a paper about 2 years ago in PNAS, where we tried to argue that that might not be the right approach if we want to go for temperature targets. And I'm trying to show you why. Here we have 2 stabilization scenarios, one going to 550 and one going to 450. And you can see the concentrations actually, it's a 510 and the other one is a 550 scenario. And these are the temperature increases that are associated with those 2 scenarios. And what you can see is that, okay, these scenarios achieve a certain warming by the end of the century. But after that, they will continue to warm for quite a long time. There's quite a big difference between where they are by the end of the century and where they will go into the future before they reach the equilibrium temperature. And this gives us one strategy in trying to avoid that last bit of warming? Are we able then? And so we published these peaking scenarios where we would follow a certain trajectory, but then after a certain time, not stabilize concentrations, but then continue to bring down emissions in a rapid way also in the next century. As a result, there would not be stabilization, but a decline of concentration, and as a result, you would also avoid that additional warming. And we believe that those strategies make much more sense. And so most of the scenarios that I will present further are actually based on those peaking strategies. This depends, obviously, on how reversible is this system. We evaluated these scenarios using a very small climate model called MAGIC. MAGIC is calibrated against the big models, the complex climate models, for an A2 scenario. It's a very high concentration scenario. So we know that this small climate model is reproducing these complex models for high concentrations. But we have never run these type of scenarios in the more complex models. So we don't know if the complex models would be just as benign, just as reversible as MAGIC. But then also, we don't know whether the complex models are reproducing the real world in an adequate way. So the big question here is, do we think that the climate system is as reversible as we assume here, or do we feel that there are all kinds of feedbacks and thresholds that would avoid this strategy? So, continuing to present our work, we next run our models, and in our models we more or less set a emission target and then try to find out which combination of technologies could achieve that particular emission target. And the way the model more or less works is shown here. We have a technology, in this case it's coal, that's producing electricity, and it produces electricity at a certain price. It's here expressed in cents per kilowatt hour. And if we increase the price of emitting carbon in the system, that technology gets more expensive because this particular technology, using coal to create power, emits CO2. So here we increase the carbon price, and as a result, the price of the technology goes up. And we evaluate that against all kinds of other technologies that have different characteristics. And that's shown here. So, for instance, instead of using coal, you could also use wind power to produce electricity. That technology is more expensive. Instead of producing power at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, that might be producing power at 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So normally you would not choose it. But if the system introduces a carbon price in order to achieve a certain emission target, if the price is high enough, actually wind becomes more attractive than using coal. So here, if we increase the carbon price first, you would switch from coal to natural gas. And here, if we increase the price further, in this particular case, you would choose wind power. There's a lot of technologies actually in our system that have rather similar costs at around 6 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour, and which don't emit CO2. It's not only wind, but there is also, for instance, coal with carbon capture and storage. There's also natural gas with carbon capture and storage. And you would see that the model will choose these technologies. So we run the model. We have an emission target. We simply increase the carbon price, and the model tells us which type of combination of technology it wants to use. And actually, based on this analysis, I personally would say that the power system might not be the system where we have to worry about most. There are, in fact, many, many ways we can make the power system carbon neutral. Like I was pointing out in the beginning of my presentation, many assumptions go into this. We as a modeler make assumptions about technology change. For instance, that wind power that I have here in 2020 for Western Europe at 6 cents per kilowatt hour would be at about 8, maybe 10 cents per kilowatt hour right now. And we assume that there will be technology change which bring that technology down in cost. The same goes for coal with CCS. We assume that the technology becomes cheaper. It also becomes more efficient, and therefore it's at some carbon price it will become a competitor. Other modelers might make different assumptions, and obviously it's important then to run uncertainty analysis and see how does it influence the results. But just to point out that assumptions are important in this type of analysis. So this is the final result we got when we run 650, 550, and 450 targets. And here are the baseline emissions on the top, and then these are the emissions if you want to go to a certain target, and the colors indicate how the model, which technology were chosen to reduce those emissions. And basically, in this particular analysis, it was efficiency improvement of the energy system that reduced emissions by quite a bit. But also, it was increased use of nuclear and renewables. It was use of biofuels. It was using quite a lot of carbon capture and storage. And it also reduced the non-CO2 gases. The model was able to reduce emissions enough to go to 450. It could easily find a solution, and it would find it not by introducing one magic thing that we don't know at the moment. It was doing so on the basis of technologies that are now identifiable, that are obviously have assumptions about how they progress over time, but it's not magic stuff. It does change things by quite a bit. This is the energy system that's associated with these calculations. So this is the baseline. This is the 450. The baseline, coal, oil, natural gas are dominant. And they're replaced, phased out almost completely in that 450 scenario. They're replaced by biofuels. They're replaced by coal with CCS, oil with CCS, natural gas with CCS, and a lot of renewables. And actually, nuclear is in that category now as well. It's not purple, but it's added to the blue part, and efficiency improvement. So a complete different energy system. If we wanted to go lower than that, and we explored whether it was possible to also meet a 400 scenario, we actually had to introduce a completely different technology in the system again. While we were running it normally under the combination of fossil fuels and carbon capture and storage, we introduced in that system the combination of biofuels and carbon capture and storage, which has a particular attribute that you take the CO2 from the atmosphere while growing the biomass, and then in the power plant you put the CO2 on the ground, so the net is that a negative emission, net negative emission. If your carbon price gets high enough, this becomes a very attractive technology. It's an uncertain technology because we don't know, we're not using CCS at a large scale right now, so we have the uncertainty associated with CCS. And also bioenergy is still something that is controversial. So if we're combining that, we run the model again, and we were able to go to 400. For us, it actually means that if you go for a target as low as 400, you probably need this bioenergy carbon capture storage because you probably need negative emissions. I was showing you that this has a major impact on world energy. It also has a major impact on world land use. This is also a result of our model. It's showing you the results in all different grids. Don't believe the results in really that this particular grid cell has any meaning, but it's just showing you a bit of a visualization of what could happen. All those red dots are used for bioenergy. All the blue dots are afforestation programs in the model to capture CO2. So a major impact also on world land use. This is the carbon tax that we needed in the model. And these are the direct abatement costs in the model expressed as percentage of GDP. According to our calculations, you would have to think about an increase of energy cost of about 2% of GDP to achieve such a scenario. These are substantial costs, but nothing to disrupt the economy. And obviously, then yourself, you have policymakers can try to find out what they would find is acceptable or not. Just to put the same results and plot them in a different way, as different targets mean different probabilities of achieving a certain target, you can also see our results as buying uncertainty. If you increase your abatement cost, you increase the certainty of staying below 2 degrees. And these are the particular relationships that we would find out then. And that not only depends on the target, but it also depends on your baseline emissions. If you expect the economy to grow faster, and that's the A1 scenario, obviously your cost will go up. It becomes more expensive to achieve that particular target. If we run our model and to evaluate the climate consequences, for the 450 scenario, we end up with the blue line for temperature increase for the mean estimate, and the blue area around it for the uncertainty in the climate sensitivity, running it against a 2 and a 4.5 degrees estimate of climate sensitivity. What does this mean? More or less, the conclusion we draw is that from the integrated assessment models, we can conclude that we can effectively mitigate climate change from a baseline projection into a policy scenario, but we cannot stop it. Even for that very, very low scenario, we still get, this is actually temperature increase over 2000, we get a warming that is at 2 degrees or something like that, but also a minimum warming of around 1.3 degrees, I believe. So, but also there's also the possibility, even for that low scenario, that we go to 3.5 degrees. So what we published here is, okay, if you aim for 2 degrees, you might still want to prepare yourself for 3 degrees or more. Again, we run this with the simple climate models. And I'm very much advocating to do the same experiments with the complex climate models and see whether these simple climate models make sense. So this is all about looking at this problem from a globe. But we have to also look at it from a more regional perspective. And that's difficult, because this is showing you the emissions from greenhouse gases and the share that's coming from the developed countries and the share that's coming from the developing countries. If we start in 1970, by far the emissions came from the developed countries, and there was only maybe a third of the emissions were coming from the developing countries. By 2050, that situation has completely reversed. By 2050, without climate policy, about 2/3 of the emissions are likely to come from developing countries. Only a third will come from developed countries. So this problem simply cannot be solved by the developed countries taking action first. And for a long time, already quite early on, we have to see a way that the developing countries come into this problem as well. If we want to peak global emissions around 2020, it's not that difficult to calculate that we want quite a major reduction as well in countries like China and India. But that's not easy, because this is the picture that developing countries would be looking at. This is the per capita emissions from the developed world. This is the per capita emissions from the developing world. That are associated with that particular graph as well. It's just the same picture, but then per capita. So, well, we are saying, okay, you have to be part of the solution, otherwise we will not get there. Developing countries would be looking at this huge divide in per capita emissions and say, okay, please start first. Why would we, with so low per capita emissions, be a part of your solution? And then you would get a huge debate about how to then find a fair solution. What does fair mean? Does fair mean that we have equal per capita rights then in emissions? Or does the fact that we have established rights in the developed countries mean something, which the developed countries would argue? Does efficiency have anything to do with it? The fact that our economies are, in terms of output, in terms of per GDP much more efficient than many of the developing countries, could be an argument maybe to do a little bit more in developing countries. Thus, responsibility has to be part of it. The fact that we have created the problem in the past, and for instance, the polluter's pay principle, does it apply to climate change? Thus, we have to say that there is a minimum living condition emission that doesn't apply at all to climate policy. We have to set that apart. Yeah, obviously, this has become then a major part of trying to find a solution. And obviously, we are very far in trying to get that worked out. The way that we are dealing with this in, and I'm missing a slide here, in Europe would be to start from a top-down approach. And that's a little bit Kyoto style. You're thinking about a global target, and that global target will imply that the global emissions have to be reduced. And then you would worry about how to allocate that the remaining emissions are about for different regions. Who has a right on what. And then, just to show that here in a simplified way, here we have the reductions from baseline from the non-Annex 1 countries. So this is developing countries. And here we have the reduction below 1990 for the developed countries. And so these guys are now sharing the problem. If the developing countries wouldn't do anything, and the world wants to go to 450, and this is in 2020, already then it would mean that the developed countries have to reduce their emissions by 60% below 1990 to still be consistent with a 450 scenario. So no action from developing countries. This is impossible. It's not possible to think of a 60% emission reduction in the developed world in getting to 2020. So it means that we have to somehow find a way that the non-Annex 1 countries, the developing countries, accept some target as well. So we increase their target, and we possibly think of maybe a 30% emission reduction compared to baseline. In that case, the obligation in the Western world would be a 20% reduction compared to 1990. Now, maybe this is not the most attractive solution for the developing countries, so we have to find somewhere along this line a solution that is attractive for all parties. And that solution depends also not only on whether we go to 650, 550, or 450, it also depends on the baseline emissions. And I'm not sharing this, but in the same article where we published these results, we also showed what would happen if the baseline emissions would grow much faster. And then this whole line moves down. Obviously, we can also be lucky and we can have a huge economic crisis for a long time, and then this line moves up. So for the cost of different regions, these two things are important, the global target and allocation rules, but also the regional cost and also emission trading. And so we do run calculations of cost in different regions. And for the next two slides, I made assumptions about how to allocate emissions to different regions. The allocation rules are not so very important for these results, so I don't want to discuss them. If somebody wants to discuss them, we can discuss them, for instance, tomorrow. But I just want to point out something else. And that's, so here we have the costs in different regions according to certain allocation rules. One is called contraction and convergence, the other one is called multi-stage. And we can see that the costs differ quite substantially across these regions. We have certain regions that could have negative cost. It's cost. That's here it's US and Western Europe. But other regions might actually benefit from climate policy if they're able to sell their emission rights. And for instance, here it's performance of Soviet Union, India, and China. This is 2020, this is 2050. In this case, most of the regions in 2050 would have cost, and only here India is actually still benefiting from selling emission rights. If we look at 450 instead of 550, the cost will go up. The point I want to make is there if you set a certain set of allocation rules, you're probably still going to find that there are winners and losers, and that there are quite substantial differences among the cost in different regions. And you have to really fine-tune your allocation rules to a very, very sophisticated degree to be able to find a solution that gives similar costs in different regions. So that is quite hard also in these international negotiations. The good part of the story is that for most regions, actually the costs depend much more on the stabilization target and the baseline than on the regime. That means that at least things that we have a common interest in are more important for most regions than this bargaining thing. But still, we found quite substantial differences. In general, we find that we have medium costs for the OECD. We actually find in the long run that the highest costs are not for the OECD countries, but for the countries that are currently very carbon intensive, which are the former Soviet Union and the Middle East. And luckily, this is also the regions that are exporting fossil fuels. So these guys are actually hit twice, and they are not the most active proponents of climate policy. Then we have below average cost in Latin America and parts of Asia, and possibly, if you design climate policy well, you could actually have gains for Africa and India. So just to see where are we? This is the red line is showing you current emissions. The black lines are emission projections, and the blue line is where we want to go if we want to go for a 450 target. So we're simply not there. We have Europe working on its Kyoto target. We have some other countries expressing climate policy. Over the last few years, since 2002 until 2007, emissions have actually increased in the rate that they are increasing. So they're not increasing, they are increasing faster than in the past. One may have a debate about whether that's a short period of time or whether that's something that is more structural. I would say it's something temporary, but we're not really getting into this very steep trajectory downwards yet. So something has to really change still. Now, one thing that is happening now is this financial crisis. And the question is, what does that mean? Lower emissions, probably, for a few years. But then, what does it mean, for instance, for the countries to accept targets? Probably it's much harder now in 2009 in Copenhagen for countries to accept tough targets if they have to, at the same time, deal with this financial crisis. The upside of it could be that people are now arguing for a Green New Deal. So possibly you could use this as an argument to do something substantially different than we did in the past. There's another risk actually from the financial crisis, so the other way around again, that we have now set up these mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol. If this crisis really becomes very tough, emissions are reduced by so much that the carbon markets could collapse actually. And so that there are many ways that this financial crisis could interact with long-term climate policy. So last 3 slides about things where research might focus on. I'm not saying that these are the only areas that we should focus on. There are many, many other areas that we should focus on as well. But one of them is the speed of reductions. And this is showing you the speed of reductions for 650, 550, and 450 scenarios. And it's the annual reduction. It is the histogram of periods across different scenarios and across different time periods. What we find here is that for 450, you're looking at reductions for very long time periods of around 3% per year. This is not consistent with what we have found in the history, obviously. So, can we think of societies that are able to achieve that? Can we think of global negotiations that are able to achieve that? Our models can. In the model, we can design easily these technical solutions with relatively low cost. But now the question is, are we able to see how that could be done with setting up institutions? So a different type of research. And I would argue that probably that should not be done in models, but that should be done by different tools, looking at these results and see what it would mean. So that's one area of research where I would say that's important to look into now. Another area of research is this land use maps, where we show great differences in land use as a result of climate policy. What does it mean for agriculture? What does it mean for food production? But also, what does it mean for the albedo of the planet? We actually run ourselves a scenario where we had great reforestation programs in Siberia as a response of climate policy, where we took out CO2 from the atmosphere by this reforestation. But at the same time, we were changing the albedo of the planet. And the net result was that the CO2 impact of those forests was completely offset by the albedo effect working in the other direction. So we want to learn much more about how these land use maps, what they mean for different areas. Another question in the same category, we had huge amount of biofuels in our scenarios. Many scenarios in the past used typically maybe 400 exajoules of bioenergy. The question is, do we feel that it's sustainable? What are the emissions from non-CO2 gases as a consequence of that? What does it mean for hunger in the world? These are clear questions that need to be researched further. Then, maybe on the more positive side, are there any things that we didn't consider so far which could help us a bit? So far, I've been focusing pretty much on standard technologies like wind power, solar power, bioenergy. Are there things that are completely different that could help us? One thing that, for instance, we have not considered at all in our models is lifestyle changes. That's typical. I think most of the models would not go into that. But we did investigate one lifestyle change recently in our model, which was, and that's not a realistic policy, but just to show what the impact would be, to make everybody vegetarian in this world in 2020. The consequence was huge. The cost of climate policy was reduced by 50%. And actually, for the first decade or so, you didn't have to do much anyway to achieve your 450 scenario. So it's not saying that this, so again, not saying that is a realistic policy, but making it part of a portfolio and making use of these type of things, maybe in a slightly less extreme way, could be helping us a lot. So again, introducing new types of thinking might be important. So findings, we find that stabilizing greenhouse gases at low levels in order to meet a 2-degree target is within our model technically feasible. We would find always that there's a portfolio of options needed. It's not like one single thing going to solve everything. There are so many different sectors where we have to act and where different technologies play a role. Abatement cost would be in the order of a few percent of world GDP, strongly depending on how baseline will develop. But, and it's not maybe not the economics or the technology that is the most important thing we have to change. It's getting the right conditions. There are large systems changes in the energy system required. There might be a lot of other barriers than cost, and just to overcome them, it's quite clear that a sense of urgency would be needed, and that's where I would like to end.
Well, brief comments by Professor Zalman-Warhoft, and then we'll open the floor for a general discussion.
Thank you very much, Detlef. It was a very, very interesting and comprehensive talk, and in some sense optimistic. The fact that your models are able to think of a world in which we have 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide. I must say that the reality suggests a great deal more pessimism, and I'm going to talk a little bit in my few minutes about what I see as the reality. Do you have the pointer, please? Thank you. Thank you. So this is one of Professor van Vuuren's slides showing the emissions. I am an engineer, but I'm not quite sure how to... Oh, here we are. Showing the emissions and the normal increase of gigatons of carbon going up and up. And this is what has got to happen if we're to reduce our emissions to 650, 550, 450. For those who don't know, the pre-industrial value was less than 300 parts per million, and for 800,000 years it's never been much above that level. So these 450, 550, 650 immensely high values of carbon dioxide. If you look at the effort that we have to make by 2030, that's only 20 years from now, to go from business as usual down to 550. That's more or less twice the pre-industrial revolution levels. We've got to reduce by about 4 gigaton of carbon, and that is terawatts of power. I'll come to that in a moment. But this requires starting right now, at this moment. And convincing the public, for a start, is going to be very, very hard. If we look at the concentrations of greenhouse gases, if we decide tomorrow we're going to go for 550 parts per million, by 2030 it'll be hardly noticeable, the effect of these reductions. It only becomes apparent much, much later. And so there are big policy issues about doing this. I'm completely for it and completely motivated by doing this, but I'm concerned about how we're going to educate the public and educate our lawmakers that we will not see these effects very quickly. And similarly with temperature rise. It's going to take a long time, and we have to learn how to talk about doing things very quickly and yet getting results rather slowly. The challenge to put it, quite simply, at the moment each person on the planet's using about 2 kilowatts of power on average. That means all the time we're using, each person is responsible 24/7 for 2 kilowatts on average. In the US we're using 10 kilowatts, where the primary power consumption today is about 15,000 gigawatts. Stabilization of carbon dioxide at around 500 parts per million will require much greater than 10 gigawatts of emission-free power by mid-century, order of magnitude of what we're using now. It's an enormous amount. And just a little example is that if we go for this, that we're going to have to turn on every day for the next 30 years or more, every day, 1 gigawatt of emission-free power. That means 300 enormous windmills a day, or one large nuclear reactor. So this is the challenge, and the challenge has to start immediately. It's not something that we can wait for. These peaks in the curves, if we want to bring them down, we've got to start now and be prepared for things to keep going up at least for another 20 years. Now, let me see what it looks like in the press. I thought, well, because I have to respond to this, let's see. So last Thursday I was preparing this talk. I looked at the New York Times. Of course, the most exciting news is Obama's presidency and his choice of energy secretary, science advisor, and so on. And the New York Times has an editorial, New Day on Climate Change, and this is dealing with the reduction, giving the states the power to reduce, to legislate on carbon dioxide emissions. But this is terrific, but it's hardly a new day on climate change. It's a fantastic reversal from what the Bush was doing, but this is getting the fuel consumptions to go to 35 miles per gallon in the next 10 years in California. We need to have cars that do maybe 200 miles to the gallon. The same edition of the paper front page was the potential conflict that is arising between the east and the west coast, where the legislators that Obama has picked and the scientists have come from to regulate carbon emissions, and the centre of the country where the coal is mined and where the power is produced and where a lot of manufacturing is, and how that this is going to be a very, very big issue in the coming months and years. So this was a front page item. Tucked up the side on page 21 was a report from the National Academy of Sciences that is suggesting that 600 parts per million is probably what is going to happen, that 400 parts per million is somewhat of a fantasy. It talks about massive sea level rises, forgetting melting of the ice caps, but even just on the expansion of water that has to occur when you have warming. Then in the same edition, this is fairly normal these days. This is ExxonMobil always has its little version, and it's quite correct. It says, well, we're in a little bit of trouble now, but things are going to keep going up and up and up. And in fact, it predicts energy demand is going to increase faster than population. There's a little bit of lip service to doing something about green energy, but the main thing is that they are advertising, and as you know, they reaped $42 billion in profits last year. That was reported, I think, in the same edition of the paper. A more realistic thing is, again, from that NATO is going to have more military presence in the Arctic because of the melting sea ice and the rush for sea routes and possession of ports and so on and so forth. This is very, very much the reality. So all of these things are coming at once. Small things like increasing slowly mileage per gallon, and at the same time, big recognition of very, very big issues. But not enough by the National Academy and scientists saying, look, this is really a dire situation. I just want to end. We've heard a lot about modelling, and I'm not a modeller, but I look at past predictions, and this is a rather nice graph that this is the amount of carbon burned since the late 19th century. And as you can see, the graph up until the First World War is going up, and in fact it's going up exponentially. This is the amount of carbon that we were using to produce energy. And if you'd been a scientist in about 1910, you would have drawn an exponential curve through it, and it would have gone like this. In fact, what happened is we had a world war, we had a depression, and then another world war, and then we went up exponentially again. But in fact, it would have been 5 times higher than we'd predicted in 1910. This is sobering and in terms of prediction, and maybe it's a very, very nice thing to see that there are some glitches here caused by the fuel embargoes in the 70s, and it shows, in fact, that we do alter our behaviour, as we can alter our behaviour if need be. But and if we all become vegetarians, of course, there's even much more hope. But what I'm suggesting is that prediction is very, very difficult. But one thing that unfortunately is quite certain, at least if we go on in any way close to what we're doing at the moment, that things are going to go up exponentially. So I'm sure there are lots of questions for Dr. Van Vuuren. Thank you very much.
So, are there questions, comments, any presentation? Yes, Sid.
I saw nothing in your mitigation schemes about conservation.
Conservation in what sense?
Did I miss that?
Conservation in terms of energy conservation, yeah. Right? Okay. Yeah. No. Energy efficiency was one of the strategies that the model chose. It's actually the most it reduces the emissions most. It's if you look across all the models, not only ours but alternative models as well, you would see that especially in the shorter run, energy conservation or energy efficiency is the dominant part of your strategy. In the longer run, changing the fuel supply becomes the more dominant part of your strategy.
Yes. So
Yeah.
In particular, I read about Copenhagen adopting a really very innovative transportation policy and initially saying we hate it, Danes don't behave that way, and now everybody's supposed to be happy about it. So.
Yeah, it's obviously a very mixed bag. We have examples also, for instance, in London, where I think public transport has been promoted quite a bit, and so there are good examples in general, but I'm not so sure whether it differs strongly from the US. In general, the public in Europe would say, yeah, we would like you to act against climate policy. At the same time, they will not change their lifestyle or themselves dramatically if you leave it to people to respond themselves. So they would answer that they won't like their government to try and solve things. In inquiries, they will also answer that they are willing to pay for that. At the same time, if the government would during, for instance, the period of high oil prices, there were clearly advocacy groups saying that we had this environmental tax on petrol and might be time now to reduce that. So there's no clear one public that acts as one actor. But there is support for climate policy in general, if it doesn't hurt their lifestyle too much. And,
Well, the question is about nuclear power, and if you consider it as a carbon neutral source in your models, or how do you consider nuclear power as an alternative for the future?
Yeah. In the model, we consider it to be a carbon neutral source, and it's limited in the model partly because of uranium constraints. And that can be overcome in theory. You could think of much more efficient breeder reactors than we assume in our system. It's not so different from renewables in terms of cost estimates. As I read most of the literature, it's different in the sense that renewables are intermittent and nuclear power is mostly a base load option. So there could be a role for nuclear power. We run the model as well. Well, it was not allowed to use nuclear power as part of the solution, and the model could still easily find a solution. That the reason is that again, in the power sector, you have different options, and if you take nuclear power out, you simply use more CCS, because that's the direct competitor. So we have freedom here to see whether it's part of the solution or not, from my perspective.
Yes.
Lately it's come out that the permafrost is melting in the Arctic areas, and that methane gas is escaping, and it's 20 times worse than the carbon dioxide. Is that a part of the predictions that you have made? And also, can anything be done to capture the methane and sequester it?
Yeah, it's not part of our calculations. So that's part of the type of information I was hinting at, what I was saying, that we have these simple models looking at this so far. We want the more complex models to look at this. Some of those models are now introducing tundra and methane dynamics. I'm not sure whether that's already state of the art. And then so I was looking here as well for some. These are the things that we have to find out more, and these are the type of thresholds that we don't want to hit too much. When this is happening and whether you can still do something, I'm not an expert, but I would say it's to disperse to really capture that. I can't see any way to do that. So if it's, I think there is, but I'm not an expert in this field, but I think there is There are researchers saying that this happened. This might have happened in the past, that it might have been cause of abrupt climate change very, very, very long time ago.
Yes. I have a question about the rate of rise of the curve up there right now. And other ones that are going up like crazy. Are they driven mostly by consumption per capita or by population growth?
In the past, it would have been mostly the combination of the two. I think if you look at the history, economic growth would be around worldwide about 2% per year. Population growth, I don't know exactly, but it could have been in the past, if you look at the beginning of the century, in a similar order. For the future, we expect that to change quite dramatically. The UN projections now expect global population to peak at around 2050, and then most likely to decline again a bit. So maybe going to 9 billion, and then by 8 billion at the end of the century. And in that sense, for the future emissions, consumption and economic growth will be a much more important driver to look into than population growth.
So I want to respond to Zalman's comments. So I also to the speaker. So it's very challenging to cut down the carbon emission, but if we are determined to make the change, actually not that's challenging. For example, I did my calculation on my paper just a moment ago. If we electrify the entire transportation sectors in New York, which means everyone drive electric cars, which means you need about 3 gigawatts of new capacity in the States. So the question is how hard we build 3 gigawatts new capacity. 3 gigawatt means three new nuclear power plants, or thousands wind turbines, or dozens of biomass gasification combined cycle plants. So I think it's feasible, at least from the New York perspective.
Okay, if I can just, I also like to do these calculations and believe that we have to do these things. I believe we have no alternative but to do them. The Department of Energy has a plan now that by 2020 by 2030 we should have 20% of our electricity from wind power, and that would be putting on 300 gigawatts of power, which is 0.3 of a terawatt. But we need to put in. The world needs to put in 10 terawatts, and the United States probably needs to put in 3 or 4 terawatts of carbon-free power. So I'm just trying to illustrate the challenge, but I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't go there. We have to go there. These are things we have to do.
Just to respond as well on this same issue. I think the challenge, this is a huge challenge. I 100% agree. So I liked your presentation. Just to put this into perspective, this power has to be added anyway. We're going just for development. We have to build this one nuclear plant, or one coal plant, or one oil plant, or one natural gas plant anyway per day. It's just the challenge is not to change the coal plant into a nuclear plant. It's not building these plants. These plants will be built. So and how challenging do we find that to build something else than we usually are building?
I wanted to ask a question about China, and then I think there'll be time for one or two other questions, and we'll close the formal discussion. It turns out that China grew much faster than the IPCC expected in its scenarios of emissions growth. It's also turned out last year China is much poorer than people thought. Purchasing power was overestimated by 40%. 1 in 3 people in China earns less than $2 a day. So the biggest emitter is a very poor country and a very fast-growing country. In one of the charts you put up, there were expectations of major concessions on the part of this poor, fast-growing country from what could get people out of dire poverty. Two questions. One, why are you so optimistic then? Two, doesn't this have one of the implications you mentioned going way beyond science and technology, that China bashing in the United States endangers the climate because concessions will have to be made?
Okay. The optimism that I showed you was certainly with respect to can we solve the problem from a technology and an economic point of view. And I think there, in principle, I would say on the basis of what we do, yes, it's possible. Whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, whether we will find a solution in the political arena by finding a deal between these different countries, that's much more hard for me to answer. I think in principle I can try to draw solutions where there are benefits for different parties. In principle, there's a benefit for us if China participates in this solution, and also India, because we, like I showed you, if they're not part of the solution and we're still aiming for very low targets, the emission reductions in developed countries become even more staggering numbers, and that would mean very costly measures that will be taken. If the developing country participates in the solution, then we can, for instance, by means of emission trading, make sure that we transfer some of those more expensive measures that we otherwise would be taking here and replace them by measures in the developing world. So there is a theoretically it's possible to create a win-win situation here, where we allow countries like India and China to be part of the solution, giving us the possibility to take less expensive measures, and at the same time giving them the possibility to sell emission rights to a certain point of time where they actually could possibly benefit from global climate policy. Obviously, such policies should then be cleverly designed and negotiated. It will still lead to enormous wealth transfers across the world, and you can argue whether that's realistic or not. But I think there are, at least on paper, ways where we can involve China in a way that's not too dramatic for countries like China. And they have an advantage here as well. They will be hit by climate change as well. Certainly India, with China too. There's a report also by the Chinese government that was trying to point out how severe impacts for climate change could be for China itself. So there's an interest, possibly. And then on the China bashing, I think that's not productive anyway. I think that there are lots of solutions in this world that need global cooperation. And China is going to be a major player in this world for the next century.
Yes, in the back.
So I agree that
Can you speak up?
in terms of global policy in general, it seems like we definitely have to move toward complex models that have to be taken seriously. And I agree that we need to sort of get the participants involved and create a new sort of research field. But in terms of what you're saying about like the vegetarian model, I do research on federal policies related to farm-to-school networks and
I think, yeah. So up to the fourth assessment report, we have been focusing very much on trying to show what could happen with climate change. Is it important? Is it not important? Is it something that policymakers have to respond to? That was the main question. The main question is now changing. Instead of proving that there is something that we have to respond to, it's much more looking into how can we respond to this. So yes, I would think that there is going to be a change in the type of scenarios that are looked at, and from the more abstract scenarios that our group is looking into, you would expect much more concrete modeling as well, where people are taking very concrete examples of policies that could be implemented, like a certain renewables target or something like that, and calculate the consequences of those. And given the state where we are, I would say that there is increasing need for such type of things